Hello and welcome to J Hutch Talks Too Much. I am here tonight with, well, actually today, but it will be tonight by the time everybody is seeing this, with my friend Mike. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so Mike and I have known each other. I was just thinking about this while the music was going on. I guess this will be our 12th year of knowing each other.
That's wow. But
I know it doesn't quite seem that long, but it has been a long time. Now,
the 2010s passed quickly.
They did pass extremely quickly, and just generally speaking, beyond in the public sphere, not many of those years were particularly good years, but they did. Thankfully, they did pass quickly. It's great to have you on. I wanted to talk a little bit. Partly, a big reason why I wanted to have you on is because I've been following you on Twitter for a few years, and I've noticed that I think you and I share a lot of the same political point of views. I think it seems that way to me, and so I wanted to have you on today because I wanted to talk a little bit about. I don't know if you've heard, Mike. There's this thing going on in Ottawa, this protest that seems to be happening. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and also to talk about how what I think the left should do to sort of react to events that are like this, because we've certainly seen them happening in the United States. We've seen little, maybe glimpses of them happening in Canada. Certainly, I think the anti-vax protests over the last couple of years, we've seen little elements of it. But this is kind of the first sort of big burst of it, I think, that maybe we're seeing. So I wanted to talk a little bit. I wanted to have you on, Mike, to talk a little bit about that. Actually, just to say a little bit about the protests in Ottawa. As far as I understand, it began as a protest against a mandate for truckers to be vaccinated before crossing the border. And then it sort of transformed into just a protest against sort of rules regarding COVID in general. And now it seems to have transformed into just a general, protest against government overreach. And is that your understanding of it, Mike?
Yes, I think a lot of the two other things you mentioned were perhaps not explicitly so, but we're there from the start.
Okay.
I think for many of the people that are there, I think
right. Because obviously a lot of the people who are there are not truckers. I think that seems to be the case. So I think that makes sense.
Yeah, there's the convoy, and then there's everyone who's sort of coming in to join up. And also, as far as I understand, this is going on. I'm not sure I can't remember which ones it kind of is and isn't, or is significantly so. But it's going on in a lot of cities across Canada where people who couldn't go across Canada are sort of going to their province's capital or things like that, and basically engaging in a very similar form of protest.
Yeah, like satellite protests going on. And I think another thing that's certainly worth mentioning about the protest is that they're getting a significant amount of funding from far right and white supremacist sources. So just to give one example of that, here I'm actually just reading off of a news article that there was a GoFundMe page that raised about $7 million that was associated with, I guess, a guy who I've never heard of named BJ Dichter, Dichter, who is made in 2019 made Islamophobic statements. Talks a lot about how the country's going to be overrun, how its values are being eroded, and things like that. So we're seeing we're seeing that element, and certainly we see that element at work in the protest, because there's been, like, you know, images of Confederate flags, I think of swastikas as well. So we're certainly seeing that element in the protest. You know, I do want to talk about, you know, what I think the left's response to this should be. But before we do that, Mike, what have been your general reactions to this protest? Has it been the same since you heard about it, since it started? Has it changed at all? What are your thoughts about it?
I go back and forth on how I feel in terms of some things. I mean, I'm very definite on some things that I think the far right element of it is integral to the protest. That, like, these are, even the ones not necessarily waving Nazi flags, Confederate flags on the back of one truck. It looks like it was permanently there, where people normally can't see it because it would be hidden by the cargo, an iron cross. I think that element of it is inseparable from the protest as such. Yeah, I mean, my main reaction to it is a great deal of anger and sadness.
Yeah. Yeah. Now it's a hard one, because I absolutely agree. I agree entirely with what you're saying. Where it becomes a bit of a difficult one for me is that I have these very kind of, you know, my politics are quite radical. You know, one could certainly call them fringy. So I'm on a political fringe, just on the other side of what I think is driving this particular protest. So I always want to be a little bit careful, because, you know, it's true. It seems to be, from everything I'm getting from this protest, that I'm politically on the other side of the spectrum from these guys. But at the same time, it's like, you know, I'm in favor of a protest against government overreach, and I'm in favor of, like, you know, an anti-authoritarian perspective. And I guess part of me, one of the things that I'd like to maybe talk about a little bit is how, you know, it's purportedly an anti-authoritarian movement, but it's not. It's actually almost the opposite of that. Like, it's almost a pro-authoritarian movement.
I mean, there's the images they're using as sort of, oh, look, we're actually nice people. Look how well we're getting along with the police. Which is sort of
right.
There's your sort of image of their love of what I consider, quote unquote, authoritarian.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I think in perhaps a way into this discussion about sort of how I think the left should react, I want to just I've never really shown a video on this, because I'm so worried about getting dinged by some, like, copyright thing. But I'm going to show maybe about 6 minutes or so of this Chomsky video. And I think you mentioned to me that you've seen the video before. But this is Chomsky talking. The video says 2014, but I actually think it's from 2009. I found another version of it that's longer, from 2009. So I think it goes back at least to that point. And he's asked about the Tea Party, the Tea Party movements. That's what they were called, right? The Tea Party. How much has changed? We don't even think about the Tea Party anymore. So there's one bright light.
They've been integrated into the mainstream, as it were.
Yeah, that's true. They don't have to have their own name anymore. But this is I want to share with you his response, because I think it's potentially a good way to think about, like, what we can do about things like this movement growing in Canada, if it is growing, and how to potentially respond to it. So I'm just gonna hold on. Just give me a second while I get to it, and you're going to watch us watching it. So we're all going to be on screen together at the same time. So if you can hear it when it starts, just give me a thumbs up.
I think the implications are dangerous, but I mean, it's easy to ridicule them. You know, look at the crazy things they say. You want to kill my grandmother? You know, and so on. And there's a lot of nonsense, that's true. But what we really ought to be asking ourselves is why the peace movement, the left, the activist organizations aren't organizing these people. I mean, a lot of what they're protesting is pretty sensible. I mean, a lot of the protests, for example, are against the bailout, the massive bailout. You know, they feel that they were betrayed. You know, they worked very hard to prevent it, and 2 minutes later they got it. And why should the bankers end up from the recession more powerful than they were before, which is what's happening? You can read it in the business press. They're exulting about it. They're more powerful than they were before. The big banks are even bigger than they were. The government insurance policy, the too big to fail insurance policy, is guaranteeing them that they can continue doing exactly what they were doing, which tanked the economy. They can make risky loans and investments. Since it's risky, they'll make a lot of profit. Money coming out of their ears. If it collapses, the taxpayer will come in and bail them out because they're too big to fail. Bonuses and profits are going through the roof, and meanwhile, people are suffering. Well, they have a reason to protest that. But the tragedy is that the protests and many other things, the protests are being organized by pretty much the same sectors that are creating the crisis. I mean, the corporate money that's behind them is the ones who are very happy that it's coming out like this. And it's a real failure of the activist movements, the left, the peace movement, so on, that we're not organizing. I think that's the question we ought to ask. And there are other things. I mean, there are historical memories that are awakened. You don't want to draw analogies too closely, but there's some similarities which are not encouraging, certainly for someone my age. These people have real grievances. I mean, I have not seen a demographic analysis of, those who call in on talk shows, but I listen to them a lot, and they're interesting. I mean, if you sort of suspend disbelief, you forget about reality of the world, and just listen. It's not a joke. If you listen, the message that comes across has an internal logic to it. It's coherent. It gives answers to people who want answers and need them and deserve them. They're crazy answers, but they're not hearing any others. I mean, these are people who've, worked hard. They're done everything right, Christian, God-fearing, take care of their families, and for 30 years they've been shafted. I mean, the people who for the last 30 years have seen their wages, income stagnate or decline, benefits decline, services decline. There's nothing for the children. The world's out of control. These are the people who, on polls, maybe 80% of them, say the country's going in the wrong direction. The government's run by the few and the special interests, not the people, and so on. They're not wrong. This is all happening to them, and the answers that they're getting from, say, Rush Limbaugh, Michael Savage, the rest of them, are, well, we have an answer. The rich liberals own everything. They own the corporations. They run the government. They run the media. And they don't care about people like you. They don't care about the flyover people between the East Coast and the West Coast. They only care about giving everything you worked for away to illegal immigrants or gays or something. So we got to protect ourselves from them. And furthermore, they run the government. When they put up a health program, it's not to give you health, it's to kill your granny. And that's an answer to something. It's a terrible answer, but it is an answer. And if you do suspend disbelief, you forget about what's happening in the world, really, it's a coherent answer. Now they're not hearing anything else. And the memory that comes to my mind, again, I don't want to press the analogy too hard, but I think it's worth thinking about, is late Weimar Germany. There were people with real grievances. The Nazis gave them an answer. It's the fault of the Jews and the Bolsheviks, and we got to protect ourselves from them. And that'll take care of your grievances. And we know what happened. Germany in the 1920s was, the most civilized, the peak of Western civilization, in the arts and the sciences, highly democratic, functioning democratic institutions. A decade later, it was, the pits of human history. Again, the analogy is not close, but it's frightening. And unless an answer can be given to these people, unless they can be led to understand what's really happening to them, we could be in for trouble.
Oh boy. So, yeah, 2009, here's Chomsky saying, we're seeing these things. It's like, it reminds me of late Weimar Germany. And then, this is before, I mean, that's the Tea Party he's commenting on, but this is, of course, before, the 2010s, like we were just talking about. It's before the Trump thing. It's before you get the, consistent protests in the States where you have the Confederate flag and things like that. But just generally, one of the things that he talks about in that is that there's been a failure of the activist movement, that we're not organizing these people. What's your reaction to that? Do you agree with that?
I think it depends on what we mean by like these people, as it were. So I think a significantly large percentage of the actual people at Parliament, are not who the left should be trying. The left isn't going to convince them, as it were. Okay. I don't know if it could have 15 years ago or something. It's sort of not really able to explore that counterfactual. Right. Because the ones explicitly waving Nazi flags, the ones who are explicitly waving Confederate flags, and I think a significant portion of people there who maybe wouldn't call themselves a Nazi, but have, frankly, white supremacist beliefs. I don't think we can speak to them, basically. I think, yes, if you understand fascism as capitalism under crisis, that sort of leads to polarization, that sort of late Weimar Republic, where the Nazis were offering what Chomsky sort of calls a coherent logical answer. And in fact, their answer was in many ways anti-capitalist. They promised to take care of the bourgeoisie, to take care of, quote, sort of a dog whistle, but like international finance capitalism. But then once they come into power, they obviously are quite friendly with capital. Right. The capitalism under crisis leads to that. It leads to people turning to fascism. And I don't think we can recover actual fascists, is what it amounts to. And in fact, I think one of the things the left needs to appreciate deeply is that political strategy and political power isn't just about persuasion. So, I do think we should be better at speaking to alienation. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I also think there's more to politics than, as it were, quote unquote, persuading the other side. For example, if you're talking about Nazis and you are talking about persuasion, the number one thing I think you need to do with respect to that is show that that's not acceptable and that you will react to someone who is explicitly a fascist, that you will respond to that with even like violence, that is not okay, and our society won't tolerate that, because your job isn't to try to convince a Nazi, right? Your job, you want to create like a big tent, you want to express solidarity and with as many people as possible, but part of that is expressing solidarity with the people who would be the objects of Nazi violence and hate, right? Mm-hmm. You want to speak to those people and build networks of solidarity with them in some way. And I think part of that is showing that certain aspects of what we're seeing in Ottawa are just not acceptable, and we will respond accordingly. Now, that being said, I think what Chomsky is also talking about is the fact that there is actual legitimate alienation in all this, that there might be people who are feeling legitimate alienation and are being provided answers that come from the right wing or come basically from capital. Ironically, he's talking the sort of congruence between the people funding the Tea Party and the people who are actually screwing over the people with these grievances, ironically. And I think, yeah, the left can do a better job of speaking to that alienation, or at least I'm not sure if it's the left, because I think a lot of it would be, as he alludes to, the sort of the liberal media, right? Mm-hmm. Which, unfortunately, many members of the right wing, I think, still conflate the idea of like a small L liberal and anything vaguely left at all, anything slightly to the left. And so when they say the liberal elites, they mean the left.
Yeah. The fact that you have, certainly you see it in a lot of the arguments that are being made in Ottawa right now in this protest, this alignment of Trudeau with communism, which is remarkable. It's like a real disconnect there in terms of, but, also I do think that a lot of people, just generally speaking, are, they don't know what these terms mean. I mean, I think that that's true really across the board. A lot of people, like I will see people identifying themselves as communists and not really know what these terms mean. So, you're certainly seeing that, I think, with a lot of the right, or the extreme right or the far right, where there's this belief that anything that is government action constitutes communism, which is, a total misunderstanding of what any of these kind of terms mean. Actually, I think I might do a video soon about this, because the thing that I always point to to people is that, like, if you look at the Communist Manifesto, one of the things that's said there in that text is, the ultimate goal of the society is to eliminate political power from society entirely, so that there's really no political power at all. That's kind of the long-term goal. So the idea that you're associating, government action with communism is not only wrong, but almost the opposite of what it's supposed to be. But anyway, well, I will talk more in detail about that perhaps in another video. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, that conflation is, I think, one of the things the left will have to deal with, depending on how you define the left or how you identify yourself within the various subgroups within it, is that you are dealing with 70 years of extremely well-funded, extremely intentional, anti-communist rhetoric and propaganda that has, the term being used now a lot, right, is the Overton window. But basically, it has completely shifted the frame, where the bounds of acceptable discourse, I mean, this is like all things Canada and the US, like this is true for us as well, just in a sort of vaguely more milquetoast version. The bounds of what leftism is in the US sort of ends like almost still slightly to the right of center. And as most reasonable societies would consider, right? And anything left of that is considered communism. Yeah. And I don't know, like, to be honest, I don't know how to speak to that or how to undo that. I think I think the left should be recovering terms like socialism and communism and things like that. I don't think one of the things you hear about is like, well, the leftists need to rebrand themselves along those lines and not use those terms anymore. And I think, no, we should just come out swinging and just say, yes, we are this, we are that, deal with it. Here's what we mean. Well, we have an answer to your grievances as well, and ours actually makes sense, and we won't actually screw you over when we take power.
Well, I think that that's actually the key thing, because you know, when you don't run away from those terms but you explain what it is they actually mean. I don't know, maybe I'm just naively optimistic about this, but I think that if you really took a few moments and all sides were willing to listen, which is not a, you know, it's not a frequent occurrence, but all sides are willing to listen. It does seem to me that the politics that you and I espouse are actually going to be something that, you know, those people on the who are, you know, falling into the sort of the right, that they would be much more interested in. Like, you know, because it seems to me that we're the anti-authoritarian ones. We're the ones who are against exploitation. We are the ones who are, you know, about as much as possible, sort of, you know, giving freedom to everybody. So like it does strike me that like if we just kind of, I don't know, again, like I said, maybe I'm naively optimistic in that sense, but if you just kind of sort of explain what it is, because I think part of it is that people on the left do fall for that, the propaganda term of communism. And it's like, yes, we are the propaganda term of communism, and that's not going to convince anybody. So like, I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah. So I think some terms you want to recover and maybe some terms you don't. Mm-hmm. I think if you start talking to someone who, let's say, is alienated and doesn't know how they think about many of these things, you start using terms from like Marxist Capital and start trying to explain, like even just using terms like bourgeois or talking about surplus value and things like that probably won't go well. But if you say, hey, your boss is kind of a dumb asshole, like, isn't he? And like, why is he making all this money and you're not? Like, that seems pretty messed up, doesn't it? I think most people would understand that. One thing I've thought about a lot is, and this again relates to the Chomsky discussion of liberal media, where liberals will espouse something that maybe the left doesn't agree with, but from the perspective of the right, those are the same thing. So, et cetera, yeah. Is a lot of, and related to, I think this relates to the trucker convoy or whatever. The idea of conspiracy theories. Like, I think there are legitimate conspiracy theories, right? Like, I think the left should, in some ways, speak to that a bit, as opposed to assuming that someone who is worried about government surveillance and government overreach is just talking about, is a quote unquote conspiracy theory with all the pejorative connotations of that term. When it's like, no, like, here's a bunch of conspiracy theories we believe in. Have you heard about COINTELPRO? It's really bad. And we know for sure that it continued at least into the 90s, just under a different term. We've got sources for that. Have you heard about what the CIA's MK Ultra program? Well, there are, related to stuff that just happened in Canada with all those Indigenous graves of children, there are Mohawk mothers in Montreal that thinks at least there's more graves, and some of them are related to like Ewan Cameron's experiments at McGill, working for MK Ultra and the CIA. Like, there is a long, troubling history of government overreach and surveillance of African Americans, and like medical experiments in here or in Canada, medical experiments on people at residential schools. Like, and these all sound like conspiracies or conspiracy theories, but one, we have the proof, and one, it speaks to the same alienation or the same sense of grievance, the same not being in control that you have, and like we also have answers for why these things happen. It relates to, well, borrow their language, authoritarian power and things like that. We have a different understanding of how that power manifests, but like nonetheless, it's kind of the same thing. And we have coherent answers for how that happens and why that happens.
Yeah. Well, and I was just mentioning this point to a friend of mine earlier too, that, you know, if you look at the last 20 years, you know, we're talking about Canada, but if you look at the States where, you know, where you see more of these protests, you know, or you've seen more of them, certainly. And I don't think it's just a matter of like the population size. I think there's a general different mindset in terms of the two countries. But as you point out, you know, Canada is sort of consistently riding on the U.S. coattails, or they'll do a diet version of what's going on in the United States. But if you look at the last 20 years,
I will say, I think our far right, the size of our far right is proportionally just as big, if not bigger, than the U.S.
Okay. It could quite possibly be. And so, but if you look at the last 20 years in the United States, you know, you had the Iraq War, where they're sending off, you know, and who fights in a war, but generally the poorer elements of society. I
think that's actually not necessarily true in the U.S.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if you look at the demographics, they're often surprised, like they're fairly well off. They're making I forget it. The average or median falls like around like 80 or something, like 80K per year. It's surprising, and it's like it's bizarre, but like it's absolutely unintuitive and not what you would expect. And yet,
well, okay, fair enough. So that's quite possible that's changed over the years. So, but they fought in the Iraq War. Many people died. Many more people died from that region, but many U.S. soldiers died on the basis of something that was entirely false. Like and
it was a conspiracy.
Right? Yeah. They literally said, we know where the weapons of mass destruction are. We know where they are. And say, well, no, they did not know where they were. And,
Colin Powell got up to the UN and lied.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
That's what it amounted to.
And people and people died. And not only did people die, but that whole region was destabilized. They became a much bigger threat. You know, essentially ISIS developed out of that, and
they developed out of the Mujahideen, like that.
Well, and then they yes, so it's been a long process. Yeah. It's been a long story, certainly. So then that happened, and then you had like people like Jim Cramer from, I don't know, like on MSNBC, who was like the bear and bull guy, like the stock guys, like invest in this, invest in that, and then when the financial collapse happened, and he had just been telling all these people to make all these investments, he was like, well, you can't blame me. I mean, the market's a fragile, unpredictable thing. But it's like, and he had no repercussions as a result of that. And I do think to some degree, you cannot blame people for having a tremendous amount of skepticism about what authority figures or supposed experts are telling you that you should do. Like, and that's a hard thing to overcome. But I don't think it helps the left in any way to pretend as if that's not the case, right? To pretend as if, like, you know what, actually they are experts and they know better, and people in power do know better. Like, I think that's the wrong tactic for the left to take, because the fact is they are right sometimes and they're wrong sometimes, and you have to be able to, but you know, you're not going to ever convince the people who think that they're wrong all the time with they're right all the time argument.
No, like related to things like the vaccines, like I don't even know how to introduce the idea into the discourse, or if you can talk about it right now, but like it is messed up that we're relying on private companies for vaccines, and that comes with a whole host of problems. And like someone who is protesting vaccine mandates will complain, and they'll use, in fact, this is one of the rare cases where they'll actually use the same vocabulary we will. They'll talk about like big pharma, although it wouldn't surprise me if anyone who's not sort of fairly far to the right stops using that term over the next little while, or gradually, because it's going to become associated with a certain far right view of vaccine mandates or government overreach, as it were, more broadly. Yeah. But like, I also think big pharma is bad. I also hate Bill Gates. Like, I really don't like the guy.
Right.
I think he's a profoundly evil person who's done profoundly terrible things to people on this planet. And I like I don't think we should trust Pfizer. I also hate them. They're the villain. Literally, they're the villain in a John le Carré novel. Like, these are not good people. Like, and we should be suspicious of things they say. That said, in the context of these specific vaccine mandates, I am not sure if that's the right tack to take. Like, I really don't know about, like, it depends on, I guess, are you trying to convince them about broad left politics, or are you just trying to get them to take a vaccine so we can end this bloody pandemic?
I mean,
sorry, one more thing related to that. Is they are also right in that our governments have completely failed to do anything except vaccines. They're not willing to actually do the additional measures that would help stamp out COVID-19 and let us end this pandemic. And we should not, there's a degree to which, like, that is a legitimate reason to create distrust in the governments. Like, it's not handling this well.
Well, I mean, and here's a case where you can be both pro-vaccine and anti-government, where it's like, you know, one of the things that's demonstrably true, actually more true of Canada than I think of any other country. One can question me on this, but I think that this is the case where, you know, Canada, I think, hoarded more vaccines than any other country per capita, which prevented. Which was all and have been a leading force in like securing intellectual property rights for these companies, and all of this is ensuring that people in other countries. I'm gonna say third world countries, but I was told recently that you don't say that anymore. But I'm gonna say that that people in third world countries are not getting access to these vaccines. You know, you look at the numbers in some of those countries, and it's like barely 1%, and that's where you end up getting something like these, like Omicron and things like that. Like, all of this is not this attitude of hoarding vaccines. Has been, in a sense, you know, has put Canada ahead in terms of how many people have been vaccinated in the country, but it's also been the thing that has prevented other people from getting access to them, which just makes this thing go on longer and longer and longer. So, like, now you have to be pro-vaccine in order to make that point, but it strikes me that that's like, it is something we do need to sort of focus on. Like, if it is in our interest to end this pandemic, then that's a crucial thing to be talking about.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually how to make that argument to the demographic we're talking about.
No, no, because first you have to convince them that taking the vaccine is a good thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're framing it as that argument might be a way to actually convince them of that, as in, look, if the vaccine is actually going to kill us all in 7 years, as one of the conspiracy theories has it, why would we be hoarding it and keeping it away from other countries and things along those lines? Like, the government's behavior is not congruent with that belief.
Sure.
That being said, I just don't know. I don't know. That's the other thing, like, related to what I said earlier, there's some people I'm not sure you can persuade. And I think a lot of organizing needs to be about focusing on the audience that can come to your tent, as it were.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now, you and I might differ a little bit in terms of who can, because just based on what you said before. So I might again, like I say, I might be naively optimistic about who can be convinced. But just sticking on this point for a little bit, because as I've said this in a previous podcast video, and I think it raised some eyebrows when I said it. But I've not really talked too much about it, and I don't really want to talk too much about it here. But I will say that, like, as being a kind of Chomsky like fanboy to some degree, I've always been sort of sympathetic to like the kind of anarcho-syndicalist point of view. So I'm in favor of, like, I think that that's something that will happen if it happens. It's a good goal for us to aim for, is I guess my thinking. And I doubt it will happen in my lifetime, but it's a good goal of a kind of, like, an entirely sort of power-free society. But in that, like, I tend to think of, like, even in an anarchist society, I don't know of any, anarchists like Chomsky or people like that who would say that there are not going to be any rules, right? So, like, a given anarchist community is going to have to decide, like, are there going to be stop signs? Are there going to be street lights? Are there going to be speed limits? Or do we all just get to drive however we want to? I think if you want your society to function, you're going to have to decide there's going to have to be some, like, rules of the road, in the name of this society functioning the way we want it to. We have to establish some rules. And I think that in some respects, the vaccine works in that same way, right? If we want our society to function the way we want it to, we should want to take the vaccine. You know what I mean? Like, and you don't need to have, like, theoretically, you don't need to have a powerful body telling you need to do it. But you as a community should be able to decide amongst yourselves, just as you would decide that we don't all get to drive however we want to drive. You go 150 kilometers an hour, or you go 20. If it makes you feel comfortable, just do it. That's not going to help. But, and we decide, okay, I think us as a community are going to get vaccinated because for the good of our community. And if you don't want to do it, you're not going to be part of our community. I don't know. I don't know if that resonates at all, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question. And in terms of talking about the classical sort of framings of this, ideas like tyranny of the majority, tyranny of the minority, and things like that. And to what extent, because with all these things, democracy as such isn't often a binary, like, referendum. No. And there are complexities and nuances in terms of different levels of abstraction with respect to rules. Things like, for example, in anarchism, the idea of veto power or something, and when that comes into play or when that is allowed and that kind of thing. And when a mandate, if a community, quote, like, decides that we've decided everyone has to take a vaccine, we're going to have a mandate or whatever, what the options are if you're in that minority that says you're not, I'm sorry, I don't want to do this, and what the options are for that person and how the society organizes themselves around that. Because I think, I mean, right now in the world, go ahead.
Now we're totally getting into an area that I love to talk about. So perhaps we'll come back to this, because I really like these kinds of conversations. They're certainly more abstract and not necessarily germane to the world in which we live. But I think I love these kinds of questions. So we might come back to that. But you were about to mention the media, I think.
The media.
Maybe
how far back?
Went right at the point where I rudely interrupted you. I think you were about to say that. Maybe you were about to say something else. I'm sorry.
I mean, the media coverage of, so I guess I agree with the quote other side, as it were, about the liberal media. Like, I think they're owned by effectively what we might call small L liberals. Yeah. And I think their coverage of the vaccine mandates has been really bad. Especially telling people to rely on experts and things like that, when clearly they're being wrong again and again. I mean, the CDC, their discussion of masks and things like that has been terrible. They've explicitly, I mean, Fauci has explicitly lied, right? He said things he knew to be untrue. Yeah. And then later he said, oh no, I had a good reason for that, which fine, like you can debate whether or not that's true. But he will also then conflate and say, like, if you disagree with me, you disagree with science, which
that's the thing that gets
not reasonable.
And that really turns people off, because I absolutely accept that this is a very unique situation, and obviously nobody is going to be able to know exactly what's going on or how to respond to it, and the science community is learning as we go along. But the problem is that at each step of the way, there's no like, you know, this is the best that we know right now, and this is what we are highly recommending. But no, at each step of the way, it's actually, you are an idiot if you don't follow what it is that we're saying right now, and if you're not accepting what it is that we're doing. And even it gets so far sometimes as saying, if you don't follow what we're saying, you should be like, you should be, silenced in the media, or you should be taken off of Facebook, or you should be even thrown in jail. You sometimes hear these arguments. And it's like, and then a month later, it's like, well, we were wrong about that. It's actually this other thing. And that, again, none of that, I don't think it does us any good to have that attitude. And I don't think it does us any good to defend that attitude either.
Yeah, my view of that is that I think a lot of that approach comes from a liberal media, and not necessarily from what we might consider the left. Yeah. And I think that is precise. That is true of the vaccines, and it's true of sort of broader issues of alienation, issues with government surveillance, overreach, et cetera, and things like that. The idea that if you have an issue with this, you're stupid and you don't trust the experts, and someone who's engaged with the media, at least somewhat, even if they haven't followed carefully and can't articulate it, knows that they've been lied to by the media, right? Like, referring to the Lion News media sounds like, oh, that's something like a Trump MAGA person would say. But like, yeah, the mainstream media lies. It lies to you all the time. It lied to you about the Iraq war. It lied to you about the mildness of Omicron and like how safe it is and things like that. It lies. And part of like that is exacerbating, as it were, the alienation. And I think that's what turns people off to crazy, wilder conspiracy theories that are just silly. Corey Pine has a good article. I think it's Protocols of the Elders of Moron.
Okay.
And it's about conspiracy theories, and it's about the idea that the media is basically just not doing their jobs. Like accusing, like not being willing to dig in and question whether or not a government official is actually lying to you, right? Because one of the issues, and I think Chomsky points this out as one of the issues with one of the, I guess, three main components of his propaganda model and manufacturing consent, is this problem of like access journalism, where you basically are going to repeat whatever your government source says. You're going to repeat it verbatim. You're not going to question it, and you're just going to post it. And the reason you're going to do it that way is because if you do question it, they'll cut you off, and they'll just give it to some other one who's willing to toe the line, as it were. And therefore you get this sort of manufacturing of consent where the government can just say whatever they want and not get pushback on it in any significant or important way. I think that is material to speak to workers who are alienated. I think that is important material to use, and I think that is something they can agree with many leftists on. Whether or not you can convince, say, a liberal of that, I don't know. Which parts of an alienated worker demographic, broadly defined, you can actually speak to, like if they frankly have white supremacist beliefs, I don't know what you can do. But I think certainly there's material there, and the left can do a better job of speaking to alienated workers.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, maybe now's a good time. I did just briefly want to talk about this because along these lines, you know, a big story this week. This has some Canadian content connection to it. It's was the famous Neil Young boycotting of Spotify because of Joe Rogan's misinformation. And you know, it's interesting actually. Leading the pack is a couple of Canadians. It's Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, who were the first two big ones, I feel like, to get involved in this. And but you know, I just to put all my cards on the table, I will say this, that you know, Neil Young is actually one of my all-time favorite musicians, and I don't particularly have feelings one way or the other, to be honest, about Joe Rogan. But I know that he has people on his show that I think are idiots. And but I do think he also has people on his show that I like. Like I like Kyle Kalinske, and I like Crystal Ball, and I like, you know, Bernie Sanders and Edward Snowden, and people like that. Abby Martin is somebody else. Like, I don't always agree with them, but you know, I like that they end up getting a big audience.
What did Abby Martin talk about?
She's been on a bunch of times. So I remember, I think she was. I feel like I might be conflating a couple things because I've seen her a couple of times, but I feel like she may have been talking about Venezuela. I think she mostly talks about things like international politics for the most part. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously that's what she talks about generally, but I think that that's what she's talked about. But she's been on there a few times, and you know, that's my feelings about the people, you know, or the actors involved. But you know, I do have my doubts about this as a kind of political strategy, and I think that in some ways Neil Young is a good example, not of the left, but as you've been saying, of a kind of perhaps a more liberal response, because after he you know, made his point about taking all of his music off of Spotify, I do want to show this because he tweeted out this, so I'm gonna bring this up. So he says, and this is clearly supposed to be him talking. Maybe he had somebody write it for him, but all folks looking, the fact that he uses folks suggests that it's probably Neil Young. All folks looking for my music can easily head to Amazon Music, all caps, Amazon Music, and click here. And then down here, if you go further, Amazon has been leading the pack in bringing high-res audio to the masses, and it's a great place to enjoy my entire catalog in the highest quality available. And so, you know, the stance of like, you know what, Amazon is actually great, is, I feel like, you know, missing the point in some ways. And I think it does demonstrate to a large degree how this kind of liberal response to all this is so misguided and so harmful, because Amazon's response to the pandemic has actually been awful. But even before the pandemic, criminal. I mean, they have had lawsuits brought against them because of actually. Oh, sorry. Let me just share one other thing here because I have it. I managed to give one example. Let's see. This Ontario probes. What's the title of it? Ontario probes possible labor violations at Amazon site shutdown over COVID-19 outbreak. And again, Peel Regions, this is just one example. Peel Regions top doctor said the outbreak at the Amazon facility, which employs approximately 5,000 workers, began in October and has since been linked to more than 600 cases. So 600 cases, and that's just one example. And, you know, here comes Neil Young saying, you know, I want to stop Joe Rogan's show because of misinformation. But by the way, Amazon is a great place. And he says it's a great place to listen to my music, but you know, it's a great place. So, you know, I think that in some ways it's like, okay, at best, if we do our most charitable reading of Neil Young, we're saying, okay, maybe he's misinformed, But if now we're getting to the point where it's like we're cheering on a misinformed person for taking his music off a site because of misinformation, I mean, we're really in a bizarro land that doesn't help anybody politically. And I can certainly see an audience of people who listen to Joe Rogan saying, you know, who may even be anti-vax, but the hypocrisy of this is not lost on them. And they would say, okay, Neil Young clearly doesn't really care about issues of like, you know, COVID-19 and things like that. He just doesn't like my guy. He doesn't like the guy that I listen to. You know, and that's never going to, again, you're losing, it's another example of where you're losing your audience, or you're losing that potential audience that can be convinced to come over to your side. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes. I think in the case of Neil Young, partly we're looking at the existence, incentives, disincentives of power that even apply to someone like Neil Young, right? Like where he's going to promote whatever platform his music's on.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't really have many other options. Depending on whatever contracts he's in and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Like he could probably he could have a pretty decent living if he had a Patreon or something. Like he'd be fine, but
sure,
he's not going to do that. And like, I mean, I agree. I think people, when they see that, and depending on how much they identify that hypocrisy, they can see it for what it is. I'm not sure how to change that, because I think that is a broader, this is an individual instance of a broader formal feature of our discourse right now.
Yeah.
In terms of what you can talk about, how you talk about it, how it does or does not apply to other things, and things of that nature. And I think that is a bad feature of our current discourse. And I'm not sure how to push back on it, or I'm not sure how to shift things in any way, except to, I guess, point out hypocrisies when one sees them. But beyond that, I'm not sure what it looks like to change that, as it were. I mean, may I ask what you're suggesting? Like, weird hypothetical. You're Neil Young. What do you do?
Oh, well, okay. If I'm Neil Young, God, I'm just thinking about what my set list would look like. No, but if I was Neil Young, what would I do? I tend to think, like, as a political act, what would I do? I think that the thing that you do, just generally, if you're Neil Young or anybody, is you try to build a movement however you possibly can build it. So, you know, and everybody has different strengths, but for one, you want to think about, in all cases, if you're a political person, I think you want to think about what the consequences of your actions are going to be. So, like, you know, I was actually, again, just to bring it back to Chomsky, I was watching a thing with Chomsky the other day where somebody's like, what do you think about, like, boycotting products? Like, if we boycotted Coca-Cola? And Chomsky was like, well, you know, you could do that, but you want to, with everything, with every tactic, you just want to think, is that going to materially improve the people's lives that I want to improve? If I stop drinking Coca-Cola, is that going to, and probably if I stop drinking Coca-Cola, it's not going to materially improve the lives of anybody. But as he points out in that same interview, like, if you organize enough people to be part of a boycott, then that's actually going to maybe put some pressure on the company. So, you know, I think that as long as you kind of are thinking about, like, you know, these are the options that I have ahead of me. Here are the things that I can do. I think Neil Young is in a position where he can, you know, he's a communicator. That's his role. He's a public communicator. And I think that during the Iraq War, he released an album that was just like, with a song on it called "Let's Impeach the President," which I don't think was going to lead to the impeachment of the president, but at the very least is something that a musician can do to potentially rally people you know, around something. And barring that, you know, do what you can to try and organize the movement. How can you organize the movement? As soon as it wades into like, how do I stop this person from speaking, though, I feel like you're getting into dangerous territory. And that could just from a practical standpoint is maybe going to be a thing that harms you in the long term rather than helps you. But I don't know what Neil Young's goal is with this. Is his goal to get Joe Rogan off of Spotify? Is it to try to change, you know, maybe make Joe Rogan see the error of his ways? Is it to what is he trying to achieve? I'm not entirely sure what he was looking to do.
Yeah, I mean, neither do I. And I mean, that's always going to be the difficulty. Like the free speech thing is like, ostensibly I agree.
Yeah.
What I wrestle with is how to deal with the fact that one side is always going to have more money behind it. Basically, almost by definition, almost in a tautological sense, it's just money is going to pay for the things that promote money.
Yep.
Like that's how it's going to work.
Yeah.
And I the only thing I can think of there is to push back on that specifically. And what I mean by that is focus on things that push back on that significantly. Pointing out that Joe Rogan has misinformation on his podcast, I'm not sure that does it as much as I think you're maybe alluding to.
Yeah. And by the way, just for the record, I think that he does have misinformation on that podcast. And I think that Spotify is awful, you know, in and of itself. Like, I think as a company, it's awful too. So like, I don't want this to come down as like, oh, he's springing to the defense of like, it is awful. It's awful. But I just don't, I think as a tactic, like, again, this demonstrates more of like a tactic that feels good to us. Like, I could see Neil Young feeling really good about his decision. I pulled all my music off of this thing, but does it help anybody? Does it change people's minds? In fact, it might actually reinforce their point of view more so than it was even before this. So like, so yeah. So I do just want to make that point that this is not coming out as some kind of pro Rogan, pro Spotify point of view.
Yeah, I mean, related to that, especially related to the Amazon thing, I often think that, like, related to persuasion and or political strategy more broadly and organizing and things along those lines, anything you can do to, say, for example, push union membership in any way is often going to have like more material benefit to the people involved than almost anything else you can do.
Yeah.
And I think the evidence for that is how much you will find discussions of that more broadly in the media, and how much it will try to not talk about that, and how much most of the framing regarding any union work or strikes along that will in fact be very negative.
Yeah.
And like still use rhetoric from like 40 years ago, talking about things like union thugs, things along those lines, as if Jimmy Hoffa was like still running things, right?
Oh, maybe. We don't really know what happened to
him. Could be.
We haven't found him yet. Actually, along those lines, because just for something that I'm teaching right now, here's an interesting fact. This just, again, is about the United States, but between 1881 and 1905, there were 37,000 strikes. So that's about 1,500 a year. In 2020, there were 8.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's where we're at, you know, right now. Now, 2020 again was not a great year, but you know, in terms of organizing, and it's certainly hard to gather people together, but still, and that was a period again like that 1880 period to 1901, and then on to the beginnings of the 20th century, when so many of the rights that we take for granted, the 5-day work week, the fact that children don't have to work in the mines, the fact, you know, all that kind of stuff, that was when those things became entrenched. And that was entirely a consequence of workers gathering together and fighting against the actual tyranny of their society, the real thing that was curbing their power, you know, not
well,
the
I
stop
think that
sign.
might be, and that might be where you can speak to people from who are experiencing alienation, especially if you can convince them of the value of unions. Like I saw it posted, I forget if it was Twitter or where, but it was originally, I think, Facebook comments. Which one was it? Was it, which in the US, what's the major like mail carrier that has a union? Is it like UPS or?
It might be UPS. I'll look it up quickly, but
well,
yeah,
it was basically talking, like they were basically comparing, like they could see they were in one carrier in a union and they were all very pro-union. Like regardless what their sort of broader beliefs might have been, they were all pro-union because they could see how their wages stacked up against the wages of all the other companies, where in all the other companies, they're barely making minimum wage. I mean, imagine if you're working for Amazon, probably technically you're not making minimum wage once you factor in the wear and tear on your own materials that Amazon is taking advantage of.
Right.
And like they could see that. And so when you get anti-union stuff like, oh, you could save $400 a year and buy yourself like an Xbox or something, like it doesn't even come close. And they were like, it was very clear, and they could see that because it was relevant to their specific situation and the specific exploitation that like basically they see every day in their work lives. And I think that ends up creating more political power because unions can also do things like boycott, or they can make election decisions. A union can obviously say our member, like our leadership is going, like, we can't hold our actual members to this, but we're going to recommend voting for this person instead of this person, unless you agree with us on this specific issue. And that is the wielding of political power relative to just sort of, persuasion, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like that's in many ways the anarcho-syndicalist model, right? So where you have these kind of all these unions, and then they're in some ways, connected together. Ultimately, the goal is to kind of connect them all together to some degree, and still kind of independent but connected. And but yeah, and so it should have greater implications than even just giving you security and freedom in the workplace, which is important enough, but also just generally speaking, giving you more say and power in your day-to-day life, power over what you can do in this world.
I think they were instrumental both in the case of Canada, our healthcare system wouldn't be what it was without unions. And in the US, the New Deal wouldn't have ever happened without unions. Even like, I guess in Canada, it often gets reduced to like one person, like Tommy Douglas sort of came out of nowhere and just did it, which is sort of oversimplifies the story. Well, likewise, in the US, it's just sort of FDR came in and he was a nice guy. So he did the New Deal, as opposed to the sort of actual mechanisms of power that were wielded by unions in order to make these things happen.
Well, and that's the big myth of history, right? And that it always comes down to this one person who's going to change everything, when in actuality, what changes things are communities of people working together. That's another issue, like with this particular protest that's going on in Ottawa. Like I say, like it's the goal of it is not how can we all connect together in order to give each other this better life and better existence. It does strike me as like a small group of people who want to impose their politics and worldview on everybody else, and that's not freedom. That is authoritarianism. Now, look, you certainly have the right to make your case. You can do that. You can make your case, try to convince people. But like, it's like the flat earthers should have the ability to make their case. I doubt they're going to convince that many people.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to how you handle what happens when someone is in the minority of a democratic decision, and how you're going to handle that. And I think that depends on the specific case-by-case basis of those decisions. Because in the case of this, obviously, we're talking about epidemiology.
Yeah.
And that it matters, like whether or not someone takes a vaccine affects other people.
Yes.
And things along those lines. Not just, you can make the argument that, oh, Omicron has now breakthrough cases, so like, and vaccines don't really prevent against transmission, blah, blah, blah. But like, even just things like hospital overwhelm, even if you accept that premise, things like hospital overwhelm affect people. Having to cancel elective surgeries because a hospital is overwhelmed or whatever is going to affect other people, and it's going to affect the most vulnerable in our society. And one of the things I think that speaks to what you're describing as sort of the authoritarian, anti-democratic impulse of this movement is the fact that you can see in their messaging, they just don't care about other people. Like the way they talk about it, oh, if someone wants to isolate or if someone is immunocompromised, they can just do that. There won't be any supports for them. There will be nothing to facilitate them being able to still enjoy a reasonable quality of life. It's just, let me do what I want, let them do what they want. And the fact that clearly this screws them over, but not me, is, well, that's life, because I have a kindergartner's understanding of freedom.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it is like, I mean, you're basically saying, like, there are people who are taking the vaccine, but are still, you know, as you say, immunocompromised. They're still threatened by these variants and by COVID in general. They might be as fully vaccinated as they could be, but they're much more at risk than I am. So what am I supposed to say to them? That they're okay? You're going to be the one that has to isolate. Like, you're going to have to be the one to stay at home. Like, I mean, again, like, that doesn't seem fair. So.
I mean, the other thing is there's a section of our society who just has to do that often.
Yes.
Without COVID, even outside of that context, they are just, our society leaves them basically.
Yes.
That's.
And there was actually very little help for them as COVID was beginning. And that's, again, another area where you could say, like, okay, the government was extremely incompetent in terms of, well, incompetence actually giving them too much credit, because it's saying that they didn't know any better, but they did.
No, they know. So,
but yeah, I mean, another example of where the government fails us. That's fine. But I actually maybe do want to talk a little bit about the point that you were raising before, but sort of what in a democracy, you know, how do you in some ways engage with the people who are part of the minority? And you mentioned, I think I bring this point up in our exchanges before about the tyranny of the majority, because there are, like, I hear that a lot. Yeah. And so this is as good a time as any to give my classic 12 Angry Men analogy, which is that, you know, I don't know if you've seen 12 Angry Men, but yeah, it's a great movie. People should watch it. Maybe I'll do a video on it one day. But 12 Angry Men, you know, it starts off with a jury who are trying to decide whether this guy is guilty or innocent or guilty or not guilty of murder. And as it begins, 11 believe that he is guilty, and one, who is Henry Fonda, believes that he is not guilty. And here's a spoiler for anybody who hasn't seen it. Throughout the course of the movie, the one slowly starts to build up, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, so that by the time it ends, the jury then decides that they're not guilty, that the person is not guilty. Now, in some ways, this to me is like almost the perfect representation of how a democracy is supposed to function, which is that, you know, in an actual tyranny, the one who said not guilty at the beginning just would have been ignored. And they're like, all right, we're just going to go with the point of view that we all agree with. But the fact that they had an opportunity to make the case that, you know, in actual fact, I think that they're not guilty, suggests that it's not a tyranny, you know, even if at the end of the day, it still went the way that it went, like it was still like, or went the way it was going at the beginning, that they still said guilty. The fact that they had an opportunity to make the case is what is, to me, kind of what is so fundamental about democracy. So it strikes me that, like, okay, if you're against certain rules about vaccination, or if you're against getting vaccinated yourself, you know, what is your case that you can make? And maybe, again, as I say, maybe it could convince us, or maybe it couldn't. I don't know. Like, or in terms of, if you have an idea for how society should be organized or run, or what us as a community should do, then make your case. And if you make it in a way that's convincing, then maybe we'll go with your way. But if not, then it won't. And at that point, I think, now with issues of health, it's a little bit different. But if you don't agree with what your community is doing, it strikes me that I don't think that people should be forced, that if you want to go off, like in those kind of old, like when you see like old depictions of things like in movies, like, and he decided he liked the color of the stop signs to be red, and they decided blue, and that's how they became two different cities from that point on. Like, okay, that's fine. You know, you can do that. I think that you should be able to do that. So, you know, so that's my conception of it. I don't know if that makes any sense, or obviously that would demand a kind of radical retransformation of the kind of society we live in now, but.
Yeah. So that's what I was going to say is, what's the next step in order to get to anything like that? Given that we do not live in that society. Yeah, I was just looking at here in Canada, for example, 3 main political parties, 3.5, 4, depending on what you count as a party versus a dumpster fire. I've never voted for a party in my adult life that actually, I've never voted for the party and had that member of parliament or member of provincial parliament or whatever. Like, literally, I've never had them win.
Right.
And even if I did, I was often voting for a compromise vote.
Yep.
And the frames of options in Canada right now are so narrow, right? Like, I often see in the US, they say, well, Canada has like a parliamentary democracy, and therefore they have multiple political parties, and that takes us out of the 2-party deadlock we have. And it's like, well, sort of. But like, because that allows Canada to have like a Labor Party. And well, do we? Like, do we? Yeah. I don't think it counts. Yeah. And even in the US, it's obviously even worse.
Yeah.
And I just saw a study that was trying to identify, it's like a very almost perfect like statistical encapsulation of like Marxist thing about the ideas of a society will always be the ideals, the prevailing ideas in society will always be the ideas of the ruling class. And that's when you look at whether or not policy gets enacted based on what a public wants or what the public wants. If you look at it, it does seem a little bit overall like, yeah, that happens sometimes to some extent. The public desires for things result in policy shifts to some extent. However, what happens is once you control for what the writers call the elites, which is, as they say, just sort of a synonym for people who are extremely wealthy. Once you control for that, like once you look at the degrees to which a public might disagree with that small minority of elites, basically there's no democracy in the United States. Like the policies the public wants, insofar as it is different from the extremely wealthy, just does not get enacted. And so there is effectively no democracy there. Like even aside from whether or not you talk about like, well, there's not a lot of democracy in the workplace and so on and so forth. Even that aside, you push that to the side, there's just, the US is not a democracy. And so given that, like, I'm not sure, that seems to be rather, the sort of academic term is an aporia. I'm not sure how to deal with that. That seems rather a significant roadblock to, well, democracy.
Well, I mean, I think that to some degree you answered that question, actually. I think you answered it really well, which is that, you know, I think that unionization would certainly help. And but then how do you get that? Like, and so then the question is like, how do you get people unionized? And I think that's where that to take us all the way back to that Chomsky video where he says, you know, this has been a failure of the left. And I think it's that the left really does need to be dedicated about organizing, to getting people organized, and rather than and you know, we've talked about the problems of the liberal media and the distinction between liberals and left, which is absolutely true. But you know, there is also this instinct on the left, it seems, to rather than organize. I mean, there are many on the left who do. I don't want to take away from them, but there's also many who call themselves the left these days who, you know, whose main tactic is to like scold people on the internet or to like just you know, shake their heads or you know, do some kind of like social media politics and things like that. And I don't think any of that's particularly helpful. And I think if a lot of them were more geared towards, you know, organizing and also recognizing that you don't have to be like the star. Like you can join a community organization that's already taking place, you know, like do something in that.
Yeah, and you don't have to agree with any organization you join 100% on everything. That's not
right.
That's not how it works. That's
right. That's right. But if the goal is common enough, then yeah, to help them do that work. And again, if it has a kind of values that are democratic, then you know you could potentially remold it a little bit, or at least help to. But I think that if that started to be the central focus, but then mobilization is also a key part of it, because if you look like in the States, the left, like in terms of like Bernie Sanders, they were organized, but they were not mobilized. Like they did not come out to vote. There's a lot of people who are like, I love Bernie Sanders, I hate capitalism, all this kind of stuff. But then when push came to shove, that youth vote was appalling. So there's you know, that aspect of it as well. So you've got to organize, but you've also got to explain to people how the stakes are high enough that they need to act, and to not just rely on other people to do those actions for you. So part of it is, I think, like communication and try to change, you know, mindsets to some degree. But just general old-fashioned, you know, getting out there, organizing. I think those are the things that help. And I will be perfectly honest, and I've said this in a lot of my YouTube videos where I talk about politics, that I count myself amongst the failures in this regard, because I don't really do that kind of stuff. But what I don't do in lieu of that stuff is the kind of like showy kind of stuff where I'm like, you know, taking my music off of Spotify, or you know, making statements about how terrible this person is or this group is online, you know, and calling that politics and then calling it a day, you know. So I won't do that, but I will acknowledge that I'm not really taking part in these kind of organizing things either. But I do think if we're talking about what's going to actually potentially change people and capture people, I think that's the way that it has to be done.
No, I agree. And I think that also speaks to who can and should be persuaded, insofar as I think there's like a bit of a feedback loop that happens. A positive one in the sense of sort of how feedback loops work, and a positive one in the sense that it would be good if this happened.
Right.
Where the people who might be persuaded are like people you can persuade to join a union or an organization or some activist organization of some sort. Those are people who will already be broadly convinced of certain things.
Yeah.
And you just need to convince them basically to mobilize in some way. But that creates sort of a loop insofar as when those organizations are bigger and broader and more coherent and well organized and not being disrupted from within, and are expressing solidarity and are creating networks of solidarity across organizations because they have shared goals for whatever reason, class, things like that. That creates a feedback loop in that sort of that mobilized power will persuade others into just like changing their political beliefs. Not people who would perhaps are not even close to, I'm not going to convince them of certain things I believe about whatever it might be. But I might be able to convince them, or they might be convinced by the mobilization of sort of this broader group of power to change their beliefs in ways that are useful and good for the movement more broadly. And that, again, that creates a feedback loop, because when they are convinced, they start convincing their friends, and their friends convincing other people. And it causes a larger shift in both the discourse and both in the material effects of that discourse, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Well, I think certainly actually being connected to people is helpful, because, right now we're living in a very atomized world, and definitely a world of bubbles, right? Where people are mostly talking to each other about things that they already believe. And as soon as you start to maybe integrate some of those bubbles, I do think it would be a lot easier to change people's minds to some degree, and also be open. I am open to the fact that I know for a fact I'm not right about everything. I've changed my mind a lot over the last 20 years. I'm constantly revising and rethinking things, and that just comes from talking to people and having conversations and being open enough to know that I could be wrong about things. And I think that's another thing, that if we kind of cultivated that mindset where it's not a weakness to change your mind about things, then that would be, that would also be helpful too. That's maybe a smaller issue, but I still think a relevant one.
No, I mean, I think that's a very big issue. I think one of the problems with it is that, as it were, the medium is the message, and Twitter exchanges are extremely not conducive to that, right?
No.
And more broadly, I don't think capitalism is conducive to that. In that,
right,
if you have a following, you can't. It's not helpful to actually sort of be hesitant and to change your mind and to admit you were wrong about this or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I will say there is also sometimes a blurred line where it is to an extent good that someone changes their mind, but it's like, boy, like that past opinion was really bad. Like,
right.
You still got a lot of bad opinions.
Yeah.
Like I see that with Peterson discourse a lot.
Right.
Where he's like, he admits, oh no, I was wrong. And it's like, yeah, you were wrong about that. You're wrong about a bunch of other things. These are actually horrible opinions with really bad consequences.
Yeah.
And so it's nice that you admitted you were wrong, but that's.
Yeah. Although I do think, I don't know. That's somebody I will say, no, I've never read anything that he's ever written. I've never really heard any of his talks. I've read some things about him. But I do think that, so I don't know about him, and maybe it's a rhetorical tactic when he says those things. I was wrong about this. I was wrong about that. But I do think that, I do try to, even with people who say I was wrong about this and are still wrong about so many things, I try to give them the benefit of the doubt a little bit and say, well, because if I shut them down, then it's like they're more likely to just return to those points of view than to actually potentially.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between someone like Jordan Peterson and someone you're actually engaging with on Twitter.
Right. Yeah, I
agree. Like Peterson is dangerous insofar as he is a force of his own with a following and so on and so forth.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
I'm curious. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're curious.
Well, I'm curious. One of the difficult questions of what we're talking about is when to overlook differences of opinion and when not to. Like what is make or break, and what is actually you will decide is actually bad for solidarity or going to hold the movement back, and that kind of thing, and what can be overlooked because there is a shared cause, or what can be overlooked because it's a bad opinion, and what can be overlooked because this is a devastatingly bad opinion with negative consequences and things like that.
That's a good question. I mean, I think that, quite often I will engage with people. Because there's a difference where somebody will make a point, which I think is a terrible point of view. Certainly, I don't think there should be room for it in the movement. But I also know that if I press them on it enough, that they don't really hold that view, or that could change the next day. Because I know people who are, and you probably know them too, who are like, one day, maybe they just like saying outrageous things. So one day they'll say one outrageous thing, and the next day they'll be like, no, I don't really feel that way. So there's a difference between that kind of person and then a person who, says the same thing, but obviously really means it. So, and this is just a long way of saying that I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. Like, I think, and here's maybe again why I suggest I might be more naively optimistic than you, that I think that there are some people who hold a view that you can't convince, and some people who hold the same view that you can, potentially bring them over to, and so I try to cast. I think that the best thing to do is cast as wide a net as possible, and then eventually it could get to the point where it's like, yeah, I don't think we have to have a parting of the ways here, and I think that's gonna I think a good example of that is Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens was a guy who was like a big, significant leftist figure. And then, a few years before his death, he's talking about how great the Iraq War is. And it's like, well, but I also think that like some of his ideas are salvageable. Like, so take the good things and like just eliminate the bad things. I can say, yeah, you were right about this, but you were absolutely wrong about that. And I don't know. Like, this is a really long, windy answer, but I don't know if that answer makes sense at all.
Yeah, no, like I think it's important for a healthy, well, broadly, a healthy society. And I think one of the problems with our current society is our inability to do this, is you don't have to be right about everything. Yeah. And so you sort of have issues of like being media literate doesn't mean picking the good media and then pointing at the bad media, as it were. Right? Like, yeah. I really hate the New York Times. Right. I think they've done cover for American empire for almost basically the entirety of their existence. That being said, some of the they publish things that are like useful. And in fact, they publish things that undermine their own sort of broader narrative. And so you do have to read it. But that is also true. And like, I can easily say that because it's the New York Times. Like, it's very easy to say like, yeah, I read the New York Times and it's good.
But if I can interrupt you for just a second, because that's a great example, because I've gotten into many debates with people about Chomsky, because people try and take Chomsky to task, because you can find a video of him saying, the media he probably engages with the most or reads the most is the New York Times. And they're like, what kind of a activist counterculture guy is this when he reads the New York Times? It's like, don't you get what he's saying? Like, he's reading the New York Times because they are agenda setters, and for exactly the same thing that you point out, that like they actually reveal things about what the elite society thinks about because they say these things like unthinkingly as if they're true. And
Yeah.
so the New York Times actually provides an enormous insight in terms of what the upper echelons of society actually think and believe.
Yeah, or they just reveal details that are, they don't appreciate how grave the revelation of these details are, or that it, in fact, it reveals something that influences some other narrative somewhere down the line.
Yeah.
Like I was reading some past stuff recently about basically Iran-Contra stuff and the Sandinistas, and then just sort of in one article revealing, as if it's not a big deal, oh yeah, the NED funded, like National Endowment for Democracy funded these things and these things. And it's like, that's fine. That's cool and good.
Mm-hmm.
But later revelations about the NED show that that's actually really bad.
Yeah.
And so you can actually look at this and get a better sense of, I guess, what's going on to some extent. But like what I mean is current discourse, a lot of it, and like what drives me nuts is the conflation of media literacy with, well, I don't watch Fox News, I watch the good ones, and therefore
yes,
I am literate. But like you can also apply that to, I think this is what you were going, like getting towards, leftist ideas, right? Like, oh, I don't read that because it's ran a story one time that was really bad. And it's like, well, yeah, it's run several stories several times that are really bad, in fact, which I find repugnant. But it's also the only place that's ever published about this other thing. And I don't know where else to get info about this other thing. And so if you narrow yourself to what you only consider the good ones, you're going to have a very narrow view of the world, and it's not going to result in a healthy discourse, or I guess an informed one.
Well, and I've also, I had to conclude many years ago, or I had to accept many years ago, that, sorry, I'm going to bring his name up one more time. Probably not, but I'll bring him up one more time. Where when people ask Chomsky, what's your ideal vision of what a future society should look like? Chomsky will say, I can't answer that question because it's not really up to me to decide what an ideal vision of society. He's like, I have an idea in my head of what an ideal society would look like, but that doesn't mean that that's what it should be, and it certainly doesn't mean what it's going to be. Like I'll contribute my view of that when the time comes. But if everybody says no, that's a horrible idea, then that's kind of the way that it's going to go. And I think that there's an idea in a lot of people's minds that we just have to get everybody to come over to see my entire way of thinking about the world. But that's just not the way things are going to work ever. It's never going to work that way. And any kind of ideal society is going to always be made up of people with various different points of view, and who are just kind of going back and forth in conversation with one another. And I think it's kind of, to talk about like idealism, I think it's idealistic. And actually, I think it's actually quite bad to think of a society in the future in which everybody holds the same view. Like, I don't think that that's my goal. I don't think that that's a good aim. But, I do think that what's valuable is that I've got my own point of view. I'm going to share it. I'm going to try to make my case in this way that I is convincing as I think is possible. Maybe everybody will be convinced by that, but maybe they won't be. And as I say, if I do hold true to democratic values, I'm going to have to accept that I'll be in a community that either accepts what I'm saying or doesn't. Which is one thing that this current protest is really not taking into account. Like, I think that's not their point of view. Their point of view is, it seems like society, I'm on the fringe of society, and I won't tolerate that. And I'm going to try to impose my view as much as I possibly can on everybody.
I do think the people in this protest have a sense that they are the majority.
You think they think? Yeah, maybe they do. Maybe they do. But they're not. Like, they're definitely not.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I agree. And I'm not sure what to do with that or how to deal with that.
Yeah. Again, that's a consequence of our sort of bubble culture, because it's easy to think that everybody thinks the way you do when almost everybody that you talk to thinks the way you do. Yeah. And is like constantly like applauding you for the things that you say. You know, if that's the world that you've built for yourself, then it's going to be easy to imagine that you're in the majority. So once again, I think that the best solution is the integration of bubbles rather than the maintenance of them.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the reasons for the bubbles are things like Facebook and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I worry that things will get worse before they get better.
I have no optimism in that regard.
Yeah, well, and I not just more broadly, but specifically in terms of those bubbles.
Yes.
Because like related to what we're talking about, the idea of free speech, canceling whether or not people should be allowed to have their say. It seems like a lot of the pushback against the idea of Twitter banning Donald Trump or banning whoever for misinformation. I think the recent one related to vaccines was like Robert Malone.
Yeah.
Like it's really bad that Twitter is the one making these decisions. Mm-hmm. Like that's really bad. And it's really bad that Facebook is the one making these decisions. Mm-hmm. And it's really bad that Facebook has announced that they will be working with organizations like the Atlantic Council to fight misinformation and make these decisions. That's really messed up.
Yeah.
That might be a point of contact between sort of, I guess, people broadly experiencing alienation of some sort. But also the reason why I'm thinking of this is the problems of entrenched power and how to push back against it. Like, when you like, to put it bluntly, you can't sort of argue your way out of it if your argument is we should get rid of Facebook and Facebook can ban you, right? Like, there's a real material roadblock there that I'm not sure how to overcome.
Yeah. Well, again, I'll go back to your answer from before, because I think it was really good, which was, you know, organizing and, you know, unionizing and things like that. Like, so I think that is really step one. And then, which is not going to be a fast process. You know, that's not going to be something that happens, I don't think, even in a year. Like, even if we all started now, I don't think it's not gonna be a quick thing.
I do think some of it might happen faster. Some possible good news. I was speaking to someone who's in some leftist political organizations, and like their membership has skyrocketed over the past year, or 2 years now, based on when I talked to them, pretty much, relative to when it had before. And I think that speaks to, I think, broader senses of alienation and senses that things are really bad and they're not getting better. That's not the trajectory we're on. But also people turning to, if people sometimes turn to fascism, they also sometimes turn the other direction, which is sort of good. Related back to what Chomsky said about the Weimar Republic, right? Like, people turn to like communism and things like that. And I guess related also to the discourse is, like, you know, the idea of like horseshoe theory versus like fishhook theory.
Yes. Yeah.
Like one of the, like, I think there's almost like a Žižekian dialectical truth in that, like, horseshoe theory is wrong and you negate it. Like the initial negation is actually fishhook theory, but like the negation of the negation, the return to that initial stupid surface appearance, is the realization that there actually is some truth in horseshoe theory, insofar as the people on the ends of the horseshoe are the only ones experiencing like actual, like, hey, wait a minute, like things are messed up. Like the people in the center who think are just like, yeah, like everything's fine. Gosh.
Yeah.
Like it, and it's bad. Like the left and the right are not the same. The people turning to fascism are not the same as the people turning to like other currents of like left political beliefs. Like those things are not equal at all. Yeah. But like what they do have in common is an experience of alienation and the fact that like things are actually not okay and things are not getting better, and they are in fact quite alienated from the political process more broadly.
Yeah.
And I guess to tie this back, this is valuable insofar as it does mean that the rise of really bad things, like literal Nazis, explicit Nazis, people who don't just dog whistle white supremacy, but who like just sort of whistle it out loud explicitly.
Yeah.
That is like a part of that is people are also being politically awakened in very nice, good ways. And there is some hope there, I think if I had to guess, I would say things like union membership or like party membership in like leftist organizations. If 5 years from now, if we actually are able to like get stats on it, we're going to see like it actually was a steep rise starting around this section of years. And it wasn't like it was sort of a, maybe not quite a power curve, but along those lines, as it were. Because I do think, again, you get positive feedback loops where you can influence others, the broader your network of solidarity, as it were.
Yeah. Have you seen have you seen the documentary? It was on Netflix for a while on Thomas Piketty's Capital.
No, I mean, I've read the book, but I haven't seen the documentary on
it. There's a great bit in it where it talks about how, like, in the 1930s, like, or in the after the crash, the stock market crash, so essentially the early 1930s, there was a oh, my computer's about to stop, so I should wrap this up. But there's am I slowing down?
A little bit.
It might be. All right. Well, there's a bit in that. Okay, good. So I'll just say that there's a bit in that movie where they talk about like people could go one of two ways. You know, in Germany, they reacted to it by turning towards sort of fascism, but in the States, because of the New Deal policy, there was a turn away from that, and there was a sort of more, obviously not the most ideal situation, but more social cohesion that came out as a result of that. So I do think we might sort of be in a similar sort of moment right now, and hopefully it goes the right way. And Mike and I have provided some possible ways to get us directed towards the right way, I think. But I do want to thank you, Mike. I have to stop because my computer is going to stop us for me in a second. But Mike, thank you so much for coming on. I hope it was a good experience for you, and I hope you come back again.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, please come back.
A lot of stuff to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So actually, if you want to stick around right after the song, then the closing bit, that would be great. We could just have a quick chat. But yeah, otherwise, thanks everybody for watching. And we will see you in the next one. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.